participants at this important symposium on South Pacific land tenure conflict. Professor Boydell, colleagues at USP, students, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of the South Pacific, I extend to all of you a very warm welcome. To participants and resource people who have come in from outside of Fiji, I extend to you a particularly warm welcome. They say that land, like financial and human capital, is a factor of production which helps drive economic and social development, generate national income, wealth, jobs, and government revenue, combat poverty, improve the standard of living of all, and ultimately entrench social and political stability in any country. Land tenure, like culture and tradition, tend to evolve organically over time within a society. As in all things, changes and solutions have to be made and formulated. Solutions must be formulated from within and must reflect national, family, and individual needs and aspirations, and the changing global, regional, and national economic, social, and political dynamics that determine our destiny. It is perhaps important for us to map out the broad background within which we will discuss this important topic during the next few days. So if you allow me, I shall make one or two observations and pose 3 or 4 questions to you. First, the broad background in the Pacific Island countries, and this is all well known to all of us. The social and economic dynamics in most of our countries are of concern to all of us, I believe. Natural population growth rates remain high. Large numbers of school leavers and graduates come out looking for jobs each year in all our countries. There are not enough jobs or activities to absorb them. Employment, particularly amongst the young in all our countries, are very high and rising. Investment by the public and private sectors fall well below what our countries need. Fiscal positions of all our governments are very weak. Urgent needs for public sector investments in national infrastructure and their maintenance cannot be met. Rapid urbanization in search of jobs which aren't there continues unabated. Urban infrastructures and services are under stress. Social services, including health and education, have not improved, and the resources which they urgently need are not readily available. Income per capita growth rates are static in most of our countries. Standard of living, to our collective disappointment, is not improving, again in all our countries. Donor attitudes has changed markedly. Donors nowadays are not as liberal with taxpayers' money as they used to. Increasingly, they will focus upon countries which embrace good governance and practice sound, stable, and transparent domestic policies. The aspirations of our Pacific peoples have been and are continuing to rise exponentially. This process has, I believe, been aided and abetted by donors and by our own leaders. Our economies are well and truly integrated to the global economy, which offer both unlimited opportunities and potential risks. We have now to adjust, and adjust quickly, to shocks generated by developments all around the world. The global economy is harsh and unforgiving to countries which don't manage their affairs well. The dynamics at the interface between modernity and the imperatives of engaging the globalized world on the one hand, And the culture and tradition, on the other hand, is a source of uncertainty and instability in our region now. But change is like an incoming tide. It is taking place. The challenge for our countries lies in managing the inevitable change process wisely and effectively. Most Pacific Island countries, as we all know, have medium-term development strategies and are in the midst of what is called economic adjustments and reform. Donors and multilateral financial institutions are, in most cases, driving this process in the region. Typical components of such reforms include fiscal discipline. At the bottom of a lot of our problems in the region is fiscal excesses and mismanagement on the financial front by our government. Sound management of national resources, law and order, tax restructuring, integration of our economies into the global economy, sound, stable domestic policies, strong institutions, good governance, and land reform. If you look at all the medium-term strategies and adjustment and reform programs of all our countries, land reform is featured as one of the important preconditions for achieving sustainable development over time. The assumption made by all these parties is that these are important necessary conditions to national development. I want to put that on the table. Are you going to challenge that in your discussions or not? With all these in place, they assume that confidence in the economies will improve, the climate for investment will also improve, investment will, as a consequence, grow, economic development will inevitably follow, and the standard of living of all people will improve. That is the assumptions in all these exercises that are in place. But I want to feature that component of this adjustment and reform which refers to land reforms in our countries. I would like, if you bear with me, to pose the following questions for you. If land is an important factor of production, will tenurial reform, the outcome of domestic consensus amongst all stakeholders, contribute much to addressing social and economic difficulties in our region? It would seem, on the balance of probability, that the answer would be yes. The survey of native lands, identification of members of the land owning units, and establishment of the NLTB, in our case, was done during colonial times. It was, I believe, easier then, particularly with the involvement of a highly respected chief in our country, to drive the process towards consensus. Given the difficult political dynamics in the rest of independent Melanesia, will the adoption of similar arrangement, which facilitates the leasing of land by would-be investors, be feasible? Is ready access to land under ample security arrangements acceptable to banks and other lenders an important precondition to achieving the levels of investment in agriculture, tourism, industry, mining, manufacturing required for us to achieve sustainable, steady development in our countries? Is this still a major problem in many countries in the Pacific today? Land is very unevenly distributed amongst Fijians themselves. There are Matangalis who own hardly any land. At the same time, population is increasing, and demand in some villages for such land is rising very fast. Wakavanua leases and legal leases are in many villages becoming very hard for Fijians themselves to secure. How would one address this as part of the required national strategy for equity and against poverty intensification? Can an equitable, fair solution which makes commercial sense to all parties to native leases be found quickly? Is such a solution a precondition to addressing the urgent and difficult problems in the sugar industry in our country at present, and in reviving economic growth and generating jobs, which appear to be the most serious problems for all people of all races in our country? Would the solution to this particular problem require goodwill from all stakeholders and our political leaders, allowing landowners to identify what is required for their medium-term needs and setting those aside for the moment, establishing a machinery which allow rent to settle at levels with technical advice if needed, which reflect supply and demand in our country? Should rent and other terms be determined with more inputs by the landowners to ensure returns acceptable to them? Should a trust fund, capitalized from public and private funds and perhaps from donors, be established to compensate tenants for improvements at the end of their lease period? It is interesting to note that, given the current and projected economic and social conditions in our country, the demand for leases from members of all racial groups in our country will rise substantially. Should the current distribution of rent and royalties amongst Matagali members be revisited in attempts to increase the share of the ordinary members? Currently, the share of a family in a large Matagali is generally very, very small. Should not that formula be now revisited as part of the solution to the problems which confront us? Will increase in rent and redistribution mentioned above provided added incentive to the majority of the Matagali members to see that renting of Matagali land as a desirable investment for them? In other words, there are opportunity costs involved, and the ordinary members of the Matagali are quite aware of such opportunity costs. And if leasing land is to generate capital for investments in other sectors of the economy, what kind of saving scheme should be considered as part of the national strategy to a desirable national end? I want to relate to you a story, a true story. I was visiting a country in the Pacific. I'll call it Country X. I was having a chat with the governor of their central bank. Now, the country was in dire straits at the time. This is a few years back. Extremely difficult economic and social conditions. They are in a much worse position today. And he was in great trouble because he saw that their external reserves was evaporating to nothing very, very quickly, and they had been devaluing the currencies all the time. And no investment in the countries, nobody wanted to invest, overseas investors were staying out, the government was running out of revenue, large budget deficits. They found it difficult to pay for their own civil servants at the time. So he said that they had a lot of logging companies operating in their countries. The licenses and tax concessions were given generously by the government to all and sundry. The World Bank had written a report about this industry at the time, and they were saying that the rate of harvesting was more than twice the sustainable level at the time. Now, the central bank, it was its responsibility under the legislation to look at all exporters to ensure that all the export proceeds due to the country were received. So they were investigating this particular logging company which was exporting. It had a $2 subsidiary overseas. So all its exports were invoiced to that $2 company, under invoicing by hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, if that was happening, then the country was losing hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign exchange reserves because they were underestimating their own gross receipts. It means that they were not paying the taxes due to the government. We're also talking about millions and millions of dollars, and the landowners themselves, the royalties due to them, now talking about millions of dollars, were not being collected. So they said that when they were investigating this company, the Minister of Finance rang them of the country. And he said, he had no powers at all to interfere on a matter like that, but he did. And he said, why are you interfering with this poor logging company? Okay. And this was someone, this was exporting hundreds of millions of dollars. Actually interfere and bothering them all the time, never in writing, but phone calls, many, many phone calls. And he said there was no solution to that problem except a few months later, the chairman of the company quarreled with the manager. They were both overseas people. Quarreled with the manager and sacked the manager, who then had to go back home. So when he reached home, he wrote a 7-page fax, sent them to the Reserve Bank in great detail, all the figures, and outlining all the millions of dollars in foreign exchange loss, and in government revenue loss, and in what landowners themselves were losing. So what I did was take this fax straight to the minister and put it on his table. That was the only way they could have solved that problem. The question I want to ask you, as you are discussing, is that how are we going to solve that kind of problem? It's quite common in the natural resources industry, in mining, in forestry, in fisheries. It is an issue basically of good governance in our country, but how are we going to attack such problems? How are we going to put our heads together in efforts to address it effectively? Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank our sponsors, our very generous sponsors. First of all, Colonial. Colonial is a banker and in Sora, property manager, property developer in our country. They are one of our excellent corporate citizens. Don't know whether the Chief Executive of Colonial is here. Our thanks to you, Colonial. Also to Fiji Water. If you don't know them, ask any film stars in Hollywood. I believe they compete amongst themselves as to who drinks the most Fiji water every day. Thank you very much, Fiji Water. And the Minister for Fijian Affairs, I notice he isn't here, but we did ask them to support this activity financially. I would like to thank the Minister of Fijian Affairs and NLTB. We believe that the check is in post, coming through the post. We are waiting for it. I'd like to, on behalf of all of us, thank Professor Boydell and his very hard working team. They have worked night and day in cooperation with our other sponsors. He has mentioned them to you. They are here behind me. Thank you all very much for supporting this very, very important conference which we are having this week. And the rest of us will be working for answers from you. I wish you the best with your important discussions and you're on an important topic over the next few days. Ladies and gentlemen, I have much pleasure in declaring your symposium open. Thank you.
Vice Chancellor has indicated that you'll happily take questions instead. I think we shall have challenge. We came here today because everybody in this room is an expert in some way, shape or form with regard to land issues. So I don't know if there are any questions at this stage for the Vice Chancellor. He's highlighted the challenges of tenure reform, the problems we face of decolonialization or decolonization, the problems we have of working in a society where extra-legal practices are taking place, Vakavanua practices are occurring, and how we integrate those to work towards a structure which will allow people to borrow and lend on land and develop land and take the country forward. He's looked at the distribution of rent and royalties, looking at changing the income that goes to the, for want of a better word, the feudal aristocracies within the Pacific. which is a fairly controversial issue, but it's certainly an issue as people become more and more educated within the Pacific, that people are asking these questions, even though some people may not like the fact that they are being asked. And we've looked at the issues of natural resources, forestry, fishing, mining, and the challenges through the interesting case study or example that the Vice-Chancellor gave of the problems that befall us all in trying to resolve these so that the people who should benefit do benefit within society. So are there any questions from a Vice-Chancellor? Full Vice-Chancellor? We have I can just talk on the protocol. We do have a, obviously you'll be aware that this is being recorded today and for the next 3 days. We do have roving mics, so in any of the discussions, if you're going to speak, please wait until you have the mic. The mic gives the power to ask a question, make a point or whatever to the person who is holding it. When you have the mic, please state briefly who you are, because there will be people here who don't know who we all are. And I forgot to say, I'm Spike, by the way, so we'll move into informalities. So please do just briefly introduce yourself for the benefit of everybody else, and we'll get to know each other fairly well, I think, as we work together on the next 3 days. Professor Vijay Naidu.
Thank you, Spike. Vijay Naidu from from the School of Social and Economic Development, USP. Vice Chancellor, thank you very much for your most thought-provoking address. And hopefully in the course of the next 3 days, we are able to look at some of the questions that you raised. One aspect of book governance, which is crucial to ensuring that, in fact, the indigenous owners of natural resources benefit from the transactions that are carried out in their name in exploiting the resources, mostly in unsustainable ways by both local and foreign-based companies, is to have people who are prepared to speak out and tell it all when these kinds of shady deals are made. So if you like, we need to have a culture that encourages whistleblowers, which is against the notion of collective responsibilities, of being loyal to the group, be it the ministry concerned, or the statutory body, or the company, or other parties involved. We would not have had the benefit of the revelation of the Watergate had not there been a deep throat. Likewise, in your example of this company that was logging forests and taking out millions and millions of dollars, the governor of the Reserve Bank of that country X would not have got substantiating evidence without the managing director who had been sacked writing back this 7-page information. So, how do we encourage people? It's a difficult question, because even in Britain, I know when people exposed the kinds of strategic interests that are involved in the British state, people are taken under the public, the security acts that they have. So I just wanted to ask you, Professor Wadanarsi did point out in one of his articles that whistleblowing is critical in good governance. Thank you, Vice Chancellor.
I agree entirely with Vijay. I think his logic is immaculate. You remember the wine box case? You remember the wine box case in New Zealand? It went on and on and on. They had whistleblowers from within the Inland Revenue Department themselves. There is a book written about it as to how There's a book written about it. I assume everybody has read it. absolutely nobody had any sympathy for them. A number of industrial countries are now looking at legislative changes to encourage whistleblowing and to protect them. And I think it's something that we can study and perhaps we should learn from in our own countries. But it's quite true. If you must have, and we should have, good governance, and if you are to eradicate, corruption in all our countries. I have to say that corruption takes place in all countries in the world. But the issue is that in these open, vulnerable economies of ours, we just cannot afford it. Because the impact on our economies, on the social income, is multiplied many, many times. So that's why we cannot afford it. That's why I'm saying that, in this globalized world, the world is extremely harsh on those who don't manage their affairs well.
Thank you. Is there another question for Vice Chancellor? The Vice Chancellor's got off. Oh, we have another question. Michael McDermott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Vice Chancellor, it's a coincidence, but exactly the same thing was mentioned on BBC World Service this morning. There's an article about the importance of whistleblowers, and as has been displayed in the Enron case. And there are all sorts of sociological effects which are moving in that direction also. They mentioned that, for example, a lifetime job, which is rapidly disappearing in the developed world, was one reason why you didn't get as much whistleblowing as you should. But with the modern contractual arrangements of employment over a period, then it becomes there's a greater possibility of transparency. So they also mentioned, as you have, the legislation that has been put in place, and I think that sort of legislation is particularly important, as you've said, in the developing world when you're looking at possible donor funding, that those sorts of things must be both enacted and, more importantly still, seen to be implemented transparently.
Thank you. Any more questions? Do we have one at the back from Senator Michele Bulanalfa? Well, Jen, can I ask you just to pop down here and grab the other mic, so if there's any other questions you can...
Yes, thank you, Vice Chancellor. Michele Bulanalfa from Fiji. One of the main topics for this symposium is transforming land conflict, particularly land tenureship conflict. And land tenureship consists of many things, one of which is ownership, particularly in the Pacific, in Fiji. All land are communally owned, or most of them. And in most cases, you find conflict within that communal ownership. And you have examples elsewhere where land are mostly owned individually or by government, and therefore development arrive. What is your view? What is your opinion? Should we transform to individual ownership basis with the protection that native land not to be sold except for public purposes? I have your view, your opinion, please.
Well, I can only speak on this topic from what I have seen, from my own little experience, from where I come from, in the north. We come from the same area as Michele. I think with regard to communal ownership, we have to take it as given. I think the political dynamics are such that we will not be able to change that. I think with regard to conversion of freehold titles to ownership, communal ownership, by the Fijians. I think that's an extremely difficult issue. Because you see, what is important for us, as I was saying before, is confidence. There are many, many things which affect confidence in our economy. We are in a black hole at the moment. I'm talking about our economy now. The challenge is for us and for everybody is to extricate ourselves out of that hole. Fundamental to that is the issue of confidence and of investment. If you look at our investment in Fiji, we have come down all the way from around 30% in the mid-80s to around 10% at present. Now at present, you know, people say, okay, our commodities prices will improve, we'll have a few more tourists coming in this year and so on, therefore our GDP will increase. You see, that's all very well, but the fundamental challenge is to ensure that this investment right across the board takes place. And now talking about private people. If you look at the governments, all our governments, they have their own fiscal constraints. They should be saving a lot of money in their recurrent budget and using such savings together with wise borrowings to improve our infrastructure, sound investment. That's vital. And then within that, that's part of the process of encouraging private investment. Within that, we have to do all the right things to reestablish confidence. I was saying the other day about all our young people in Fiji. I think I will bore you, some of you. We have 15,000 young people coming out today. We are concerned at the university because, you know, we have a lot of graduates coming out. And you see them coming out of schools at a time when unemployment is already increasing. And we've been losing jobs too. So we are adding to this large pool of employment every year. So we have to move the economic confidence and so on. If you're talking about communalizing lands which are owned individually as freehold, we ask ourselves the same question. In addition to other things which we should do to reestablish confidence and things which you shouldn't do towards the same objective, how will this affect? Very important factor. And we're talking about investments and jobs. We are talking about investment and jobs for everyone in the country. You can't have improvement in government revenue for them to be able to provide all the services if this economy is not going to be moving anywhere. In other words, we have a collective interest in Fiji. Each and every one of us, individuals, our political leaders. I would have thought that the objective is quite clear. And if you sit around the room, and you're all sitting around the room, in terms of coming forth with what we should collectively do, I would have thought that that's not a difficult exercise. So in short, I think we have to live with that. The challenge is always in the mechanism for ensuring that land is readily available, not the ownership, but the use of it, to those who will be wanting it through leases. And as I said before, if you look at the population movement, the structure, the economic, the way we are moving, there will be a lot of demand for leases by all races. I know of a lot of frustrated Fijians, who have nowhere else to go. They are desperately trying to find a piece of land to lease. I know where I come from, even from the same village. The Matangalis, who don't own any land, were desperately wanting to lease land from the other Matangalis. They are very closely related. They have been thoroughly frustrated. Vitali here is to run the Native Lands Trust Board. He knows a lot of these things in greater detail than I do, but thank you.
Vice Chancellor, thank you very much indeed. We have a limit really on time to talk now, but the Vice Chancellor will be with us for part of the conference, or symposium, should I say, over the next 3 days. So can I ask you join me in thanking the Vice Chancellor very much for his opening address, and we will move on to the symposium. Thank you, sir.